billionaire was laughed out of a luxury store. By nightfall, his legal army turned the city on its head. Wait till you hear the recording that made the board go white. The rain had just begun to fall when Adrian Knight stepped out of his black car and approached the entrance of the luxury retailer's flagship store, his platinum membership card held casually in his hand. He had built companies worth billions, signed contracts that shaped entire industries, and yet in that moment, he looked like any other man, his tailored suit darkened by the drizzle, his silver hair slicked neatly back. The glass doors gleamed under the city lights, reflecting the promise of luxury inside. But before he could step forward, two security guards crossed their arms and blocked his path. One of them glanced at the card in his hand and smirked as though it were nothing more than a scrap of plastic. "I'm here for a private showing," Adrian said evenly, his voice calm but carrying the authority of someone unaccustomed to refusal. The guard shook his head, his tone clipped. "Members only." Adrian held the card a little higher, its embossed platinum surface catching the glow of the entrance lights. "This should be enough," he replied, but the guard did not move. Inside, through the transparent glass, Adrian could see rows of polished marble floors, chandeliers dripping with crystals, and associates bustling with practiced smiles as they greeted other customers. None of them looked in his direction. The second guard stepped closer, his hand resting lightly on Adrian's arm as though to steer him away. "Sir, this isn't for you," he said, his voice low, firm, final. For a moment, Adrian almost laughed at the absurdity. He had invested millions into this very retailer during its early expansion, had once sat in the same boardroom with the executives who now allowed their employees to treat him as a stranger. But he did not laugh. He stood still, his eyes on the golden logo above the door, the same logo that had been stamped on the first luxury gift he ever bought his late wife years ago. A couple walked past him, their perfume lingering in the air, their laughter quick and careless. The guard shifted aside for them without question, bowing slightly as if welcoming royalty. Adrian's chest tightened. He was being measured not by his achievements or his wealth, but by some unspoken judgment of appearance, by the shallow lens of assumption. The drizzle turned to rain, drops sliding down the glass doors, blurring his reflection until it seemed as if he were fading into invisibility. He could have pushed, could have demanded they check the system, could have called the manager by name and reminded him of old favors owed. Instead, Adrian slipped the card back into his pocket and stepped away, his shoes splashing lightly against the wet pavement. Inside, he heard the faint sound of laughter, the muffled voice of an executive pointing him out, mocking the sight of a man denied entry. He felt the heat of humiliation rise but kept his expression steady, his stride unbroken. Adrian Knight, billionaire, innovator, builder of empires, turned his back on the velvet rope and walked into the rain, already knowing this night would not end here. The moment Adrian stepped back from the velvet rope, the glass doors whispered shut behind him, sealing away the laughter that still carried faintly to the street. Inside, executives dressed in tailored suits leaned toward each other with smirks tugging at their lips, their words muffled, but their expressions unmistakable. To them, it was a small spectacle, a billionaire denied entry, a man stripped of his aura of power for one brief moment, and the sight amused them more than it surprised them. Adrian could feel their eyes pressing against his back even as the rain soaked into his suit, and though his stride was steady, each step carried the weight of dismissal. He reached the edge of the curb where his driver stood ready to open the door, but he lifted his hand, signaling him to wait. Adrian did not want the comfort of leather seats just yet. He wanted the raw sting of the city air, the drizzle sharp against his skin, reminding him that this was no dream. He looked once more at the gleaming facade of the store, the marble staircase that led upward, the chandeliers dripping light over customers who would never know the man who had financed half the foundation beneath their feet. The executives inside leaned casually against glass counters, their voices drifting out when the doors opened briefly to admit another guest. "Imagine, the great Adrian Knight, card in hand like any common shopper," one of them said, the mockery slipping free, followed by laughter that struck him harder than any insult spoken to his face. Adrian inhaled slowly, his jaw tight, but his posture unbroken. He was no stranger to betrayal, no stranger to envy, but the cruelty in their amusement cut differently. These were men and women who had sat across from him in meetings, who had raised champagne glasses at launches he orchestrated, who had once depended on his vision to build their careers. And yet the moment he stood outside their gilded walls, denied by two guards who did not even recognize his name, they found it easier to laugh than to remember. He turned at last toward the waiting car, his shoes striking the pavement with a rhythm that betrayed none of the turmoil within. The driver opened the door quietly, avoiding eye contact, though Adrian sensed he had heard everything. Sliding into the back seat, Adrian kept his face expressionless, his silence a shield. As the city lights streaked across the window, he caught his reflection in the glass, blurred by raindrops, a man who had once been seen as untouchable, now reduced to the subject of a private joke. The humiliation lingered not in the denial itself, but in the ease with which they had dismissed him, the speed with which his name had been stripped of its weight. Adrian leaned back against the seat, his hand brushing against the platinum card still in his pocket. To them it was only metal, meaningless without the recognition of status, but to him it was a reminder of how quickly respect could vanish. He said nothing as the car moved through the wet streets, but in his silence the sting sharpened into resolve, and beneath the quiet humiliation, something harder began to form. By the time Adrian arrived at the company headquarters the following morning, the story had already taken on a life of its own. The marble lobby buzzed with whispers that ceased when he stepped out of the elevator, but he could feel the shift in the air, the quick glances, the forced smiles. He moved with his usual calm stride, his shoes clicking softly against polished floors, but every step seemed to echo louder than before. When he reached the top floor, he paused outside the boardroom, intending only to collect his thoughts before entering, but the voices inside caught his attention. "They say he stood outside like some lost customer," one board member chuckled. His words carried clearly through the partially open door. Another voice chimed in, dripping with amusement. "Imagine Adrian Knight, the visionary, the billionaire, unable to walk through a pair of glass doors. Reputation is everything in this business, and his just cracked." Laughter followed, low and mean, the kind that grows when people feel safe behind closed doors. Adrian remained still, his hand resting against the doorframe, his eyes fixed on the city skyline visible through the hall windows. A third voice, colder, sharper, spoke with less humor and more calculation. "This is not about the store, it is about perception. If investors think he has lost his influence, if clients believe he can be dismissed like any other man, then perhaps it is time to consider new leadership." The room fell into a thoughtful silence before another voice agreed. "He has been too focused on ideals, too distracted with grand visions. What we need is stability, not ambition. Stability keeps shareholders comfortable." Adrian's jaw tightened, his pulse steady but heavy. These were the very people who had once praised him as a genius, who had sat at dinners raising toasts to his foresight, who had called him indispensable when his ideas brought them profits. Now they weighed his worth like merchants discussing the value of worn-out goods. He listened as they dissected his image, his influence, his future, all with the cold detachment of surgeons cutting into flesh that did not bleed in their hands. He thought of walking in, confronting them, reminding them of the empire he had built brick by brick, deal by deal, but he stayed where he was. To enter now would be to show them the sting of their words, and he refused to give them that satisfaction. Instead, he memorized each voice, each phrase, tucking them away like evidence. The laughter, the dismissive tones, the easy betrayal, all of it settled into him like shards of glass. When the boardroom door finally opened, the laughter cut off, replaced by polite nods and carefully arranged smiles. Adrian stepped aside to let them pass, his expression unreadable, his silence deeper than any response he could have given. Inside him, the humiliation of the previous night merged with the betrayal of this morning, shaping into something colder, sharper, more dangerous. They had mistaken him for a man defeated, when in truth they had awakened a man who now had reason to fight, not just for his pride, but for his place in the empire he had created. Adrian's apartment overlooked the city he had helped shape, its skyline glittering with towers that bore his influence. But that evening the view seemed colder, the lights distant and indifferent. He set his briefcase down by the door, loosened his tie, and tried to push away the sting of the boardroom whispers. He poured himself a glass of water, the silence of the room pressing in heavier than usual. When the knock came at his door, he expected it to be his driver returning with a forgotten file, or perhaps a neighbor passing by. But instead it was a courier in a black suit, holding a thick envelope stamped with the company seal. Adrian signed automatically, though a quiet unease settled over him as he broke the wax. The words inside cut sharper than any blade. A formal resolution, signed by nearly every board member, declaring a vote of no confidence in his leadership. The language was polished and professional, but each line dripped with accusation. They cited reputational damage, loss of influence, questions of judgment. They framed it not as betrayal, but as necessity, claiming to protect shareholders, to preserve stability, to safeguard the future. At the bottom, beneath elegant signatures, was the final blow, his immediate removal as chief executive officer pending legal confirmation. Adrian read the words twice, then a third time, his hand tightening around the paper until it creased. It was a metaphorical eviction, but it felt no less brutal than being forced into the street. The company he had built from an idea sketched on a napkin had turned its back on him, casting him out of the very halls he had designed, the boardrooms where he had fought for every expansion, every acquisition, every innovation. He looked around his apartment, once filled with pride and trophies of success, and for the first time it felt temporary, as though at any moment someone might arrive to change the locks. He walked to the window, the city lights shimmering below. Each tower, each bridge, each district carried echoes of his influence, yet here he stood exiled by his own creation. He remembered the night he had signed the founding documents, the sense of promise, the certainty that no one could take from him what he had built. Now that certainty lay shattered, replaced by the cold language of betrayal dressed up as strategy. His phone buzzed with messages from journalists seeking comment, from acquaintances offering half-hearted sympathies, from investors pretending concern while probing for weakness. Adrian ignored them all. He set the letter on his desk, the weight of it heavier than its paper, and sat in silence. For a moment he allowed himself to feel the sting, the humiliation, the sense of being cast out of his own home. Then slowly he straightened his back, his eyes hardening. They believed they had exiled him, but they had only given him a reason to fight. A vote of no confidence might remove him from a title, but it could not erase the man who had built an empire brick by brick. The office that had once been Adrian's command center now felt like a museum stripped of meaning. His nameplate was already gone from the door, his assistant dismissed by an impersonal email, and the shelves that once displayed awards and models of projects were bare, except for a few forgotten binders. He entered quietly, the security guard posted in the hall, watching with a mix of pity and suspicion. Adrian ignored him, moving to his desk, running a hand across the polished wood that had witnessed countless late nights and decisive mornings. He began packing slowly, methodically, placing framed photographs into a box, the picture of his wife tucked carefully between stacks of old reports. Every object he touched seemed to carry a weight, a reminder of years now reduced to a single vote of no confidence. He opened the bottom drawer, expecting to find only the usual collection of pens, cables, and documents waiting to be shredded, but a thick folder caught his attention. Its tab was labeled innocuously, Quarterly Review, but the weight of the papers inside told a different story. He flipped it open, and his eyes narrowed as he scanned the contents. At first, it appeared to be routine financial statements, but deeper within, he found contracts bearing signatures of board members alongside executives from a rival corporation. The dates were recent, the language precise, and the intent unmistakable. They were not simply entertaining offers, they were forming a secret alliance, transferring intellectual property and supply chain rights in exchange for personal profit. Adrian sat down heavily, the chair creaking beneath him. Each page revealed more betrayal, clauses designed to weaken his position, provisions that would dismantle the company's independence. He recognized the careful hand of those who had mocked him in the boardroom, weaving their conspiracy while smiling to his face. The humiliation at the store had not been a random embarrassment. It had been fuel for their strategy, a staged spectacle to undermine his reputation and clear the path for their scheme. His pulse quickened as he realized how close they were to success. Had he not stumbled upon these files while packing, the alliance might have been signed within weeks, leaving him powerless, his empire carved up and sold in pieces. He traced the signatures with his finger, names he had once trusted, allies who had toasted to his victories. Now they were traitors hiding behind polished language and confidential agreements. He slipped the folder into his briefcase, careful to conceal it beneath the personal items he had packed. The security guard peered in through the glass, but Adrian only gave a curt nod before closing the case. For the first time since the humiliation began, a spark of resolve lit within him. They had evicted him from his throne, but they had also left behind the rope that could pull their conspiracy into the light. He stood, adjusting his jacket, the weight of the briefcase reassuring in his hand. The paper trail was his weapon, and though they believed him finished, Adrian Knight was far from defeated. Adrian left the building with the heavy briefcase in hand, his steps steady but his mind racing, the betrayal he had uncovered pressing against him like a weight. The city air felt sharp, cutting through his composure, yet he held his head high as he moved toward the parking garage. It was there in the dim fluorescent light that a quiet voice stopped him. "Mr. Knight," it whispered, hesitant but urgent. He turned and saw Maria Lopez, a mid-level legal associate he vaguely remembered from compliance meetings, standing in the shadow of a concrete pillar. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple knot, her suit plain compared to the tailored elegance of the board members, but her eyes were steady, focused. She held a folder pressed tightly against her chest, as though it might burn her if she loosened her grip. "You should not be here," Adrian said, his tone measured, wary of prying ears. Maria stepped closer, her voice low. "Neither should you, but we do what we must." Read this carefully. She extended the folder toward him, her hand trembling only slightly. He accepted it, his brows furrowing as he opened the cover. Inside were legal drafts, memoranda, and notes that left no doubt about the board's betrayal. Pages outlined strategies to force him out, communications with the rival corporation disguised as unrelated partnerships, and evidence of meetings scheduled months before the so-called incident at the store. They had not only conspired against him, they had been preparing his downfall meticulously. Adrian looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "Why are you showing me this?" Maria's lips tightened. "Because I have spent years buried in paperwork for men who never learned my name, watching them twist the law to serve themselves. I could not stop them alone, but I could keep records. Every clause, every signature, every timestamp. I saved it." She drew in a breath as though bracing herself. "They think I am invisible, but invisibility has its advantages." For a long moment they stood in silence, the hum of the garage filling the space between them. Adrian studied her, recognizing the same quiet resilience he had carried in recent days. She had been overlooked, underestimated, and now her loyalty was a weapon. "You risk everything by coming to me," he said at last. Maria shook her head. "I already risked everything by staying silent this long. At least now I choose the side I believe in." Adrian slipped the folder into his briefcase alongside the earlier files, the pieces of the puzzle aligning with grim clarity. The board had believed their plan flawless, but they had not counted on the loyalty of someone they ignored, nor the determination of the man they tried to exile. He closed the case, the click of the lock sounding like the start of a new chapter. "They have underestimated us both," he said quietly, meeting her gaze. Maria allowed herself the faintest smile, then melted back into the shadows, leaving him with the knowledge that he was no longer fighting alone. Adrian sat alone at his dining table that night, the city lights stretching endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, his briefcase open before him. He drew out the folder Maria had slipped to him, his fingers brushing the rough edge of the papers as though they were alive with electricity. He began reading, his eyes moving quickly, scanning the precise language that at first appeared routine. These were contracts drafted with professional care, polished lines of corporate jargon that looked harmless on the surface. But Adrian had spent decades navigating documents like these. He knew where to look, where the poison could hide. Slowly, he began to see it. The buried clauses tucked into dense paragraphs, legal traps that if signed would cut him off from the empire he had built. He read one line again and again, hardly believing it. A clause that reassigned voting rights from the founding partner to the collective discretion of the board, citing reputational crisis as grounds for immediate suspension. His title as founder would remain, but his influence would vanish, reduced to ceremonial recognition. Another clause slid in beneath a paragraph on intellectual property, transferring all patents and trademarks associated with his name into a subsidiary controlled by the rival corporation. On paper, it looked like streamlining, but in reality it was theft wrapped in legality. They were not content to push him aside. They wanted to erase his fingerprints entirely, leaving him as nothing more than a memory while they harvested the fruits of his labor. The betrayal cut deeper than the humiliation at the store, deeper than the laughter of executives who dismissed him as ordinary. This was not careless cruelty. This was deliberate, engineered treachery. They had plotted for months, maybe years, weaving a web of clauses that would hold even in court if left unchallenged. He felt a slow burn rise in his chest, not of panic, but of fury controlled by discipline. The people he had trusted most, the very ones he had raised to positions of power, had crafted a quiet coup masked as strategy. He turned another page and saw notes in the margins, initials of board members approving adjustments, subtle amendments to further tighten the noose. Each signature was like a knife, each flourish of ink a reminder that loyalty in the world he had built was an illusion. He leaned back in his chair, his hand gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles whitened. For years he had believed that vision and results earned respect, but here was proof that power was only respected until envy found a way to steal it. Closing the folder, Adrian rested his hand on its cover, the weight of the documents grounding him. They thought they had hidden their betrayal in shadows, but shadows could be pierced by light, and he still had the strength to strike it. His humiliation had given them laughter, but this discovery gave him purpose. They wanted him silent, erased, forgotten. Instead, they had handed him the weapon he needed to fight back. The clock on the wall struck 2 a.m, but Adrian had not closed his eyes once. He sat in the living room of his penthouse, the city stretched wide beneath him, towers gleaming like cold sentinels. The silence inside was heavy, broken only by the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the clock. Before him on the glass coffee table lay the folders, their pages spread open like an autopsy of his life's work. Contracts, clauses, betrayals written in polished legal language. Each one a reminder that the empire he had built was now dangling over a cliff. He leaned back in the leather chair, running a hand through his silver hair, his eyes dry and burning. For years he had poured himself into the company, missing dinners, sacrificing sleep, enduring endless battles with competitors, and now it was slipping away through the hands of men who had never carried the weight of creation. He thought of his late wife, how she had once told him that his company was like their child, something he nurtured, something he fought for. Would he let it be stolen in silence? The question cut deeper than any insult or dismissal. Outside, the city pulsed with life even at that hour, cars weaving through empty streets, neon signs flashing promises of distraction. Adrian watched but felt no connection, as if he were standing behind glass while the world moved on without him. He pressed his palms together, the folder with Maria's notes still open. The buried clauses could take everything, but they were also evidence, and evidence was a weapon in the right hands. He reached for his phone, hesitating only briefly before scrolling through his contacts. His thumb stopped on a name he had not dialed in years, Thomas Grant. Thomas had been his ally since the early days, a litigator with a reputation for dismantling opponents with surgical precision. They had not spoken often in recent years, but Adrian knew he could trust him when it mattered most. He pressed the call button, the ringing sounding impossibly loud in the quiet penthouse. After a long pause, a gravelly voice answered, heavy with sleep, but sharp with recognition. "Adrian, it's been a long time." Adrian exhaled, the first real release of the night. "Too long, but I need your help." He explained in clipped sentences, his voice low, measured, but beneath the calm, Thomas could hear the urgency. When Adrian finished, silence lingered on the line before Thomas spoke. "If what you're saying is true, they've committed corporate fraud. You have leverage, but timing is everything. Do you still have the documents?" "They're in front of me," Adrian replied, his hand resting on the stack. Thomas's voice hardened. "Good. Don't let them out of your sight. We'll meet tomorrow at dawn. This is going to get ugly, but if they wanted war, they chose the wrong man." When the call ended, Adrian set the phone down, his chest tight but steadier than before. He looked again at the city, the sleepless empire he had built. He would not surrender it. The first light of dawn crept across the skyline when Adrian stepped into the private conference room of a downtown law firm, the air sharp with the smell of coffee and paper fresh from the printer. The glass walls reflected the city waking below, but inside the room there was no sign of sleepiness, only focus. Waiting for him were men and women in tailored suits, their expressions grave, their briefcases resting on the polished table like weapons ready to be drawn. At the head sat Thomas Grant, his old friend, his silver hair combed neatly back, his eyes alive with a kind of energy that came only when a fight was near. Adrian greeted him with a firm handshake, and Thomas gestured for him to sit. Around them, paralegals arranged binders in neat stacks, pages marked with tabs of bright color, each one representing hours of research compressed into organized precision. "We've been through your documents," Thomas said, his voice steady, his tone carrying authority. "You weren't exaggerating. This isn't just betrayal, it's coordinated fraud. They buried these clauses to cut you out completely, and they timed the vote of no confidence to align with the transfer agreements. If you hadn't caught this, by the end of the month, you would have been erased." The room was silent as the lawyers studied Adrian, their faces reflecting a mix of respect and determination. They knew this was not just another case. This was a battle for survival against some of the most powerful executives in the city. Thomas tapped the folder with his finger. "We'll need affidavits. We'll need witnesses. We'll need to hit them with everything at once. If we wait, they'll bury us in procedure. We strike today." Adrian leaned forward, his hands clasped. "You'll have everything you need. Maria Lopez has more documents. She kept records they don't know exist. She's willing to testify." A murmur of approval passed around the table. One of the younger lawyers, sharp-eyed and confident, said, "A loyal insider. That changes everything. If she stands in court with these files, we can show intent and conspiracy." Thomas nodded. "Then it's settled. We move fast. By the end of today, injunctions will be filed, assets frozen, subpoenas issued. They wanted you isolated, but instead, you'll walk into court with an army." He looked around at his team, his voice rising. "This isn't a defense, this is an attack. We dismantle their scheme clause by clause, signature by signature. We make it clear to the court that they didn't just betray a man, they betrayed the law." The lawyers nodded in unison, their faces hard, their posture sharp, and in that moment Adrian felt something shift. The humiliation of being turned away at the store, the whispers in the boardroom, the exile from his own company, all of it condensed into a single purpose. He looked at the team before him, this private army in suits and ties, and he knew the storm was about to break. The courtroom was filled before the session even began, reporters lining the back rows, investors whispering among themselves, and curious onlookers craning for a glimpse of the man who had once been untouchable. Adrian sat at the front beside Thomas Grant, his legal team arranged like a wall of steel at his side, their binders stacked, their laptops glowing. Across the aisle sat the board members, polished and confident in appearance, though Adrian noticed the small signs of unease, a restless hand on the table, a darting glance toward the gallery. The judge entered, the gavel struck, and silence fell heavy over the room. The proceedings began with dry legal language, motions, and objections, But the tension broke when Thomas called the first witness. All eyes turned as Maria Lopez walked to the stand, her steps careful, her face pale but determined. She took the oath, sat down, and for a moment it seemed her voice might fail her. But when Thomas asked the first question, the words came, fragile but sharp. The board manufactured a scandal to oust Mr. Knight. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd, the judge raising a hand for quiet. But the message had landed. Thomas asked her to explain, and Maria opened the folder she had guarded for months. On the screens positioned around the courtroom, emails flashed in bold projection. Dates, signatures, conversations between board members and rival executives, mocking Adrian, strategizing his downfall, weaving the plan with casual cruelty. One message read, "Stage the denial at the flagship store. Let the press see him diminished. It will make the vote easier to justify." Gasps filled the room, the weight of proof undeniable. Adrian kept his face steady, but inside he felt the old anger tighten into something colder, something close to vindication. The defense tried to shake Maria, their questions sharp, their tone dismissive, but she held her ground. "I was there," she said, her voice steadier now. "I reviewed the drafts. I tracked the amendments. They buried clauses to strip him of power. They coordinated with outside parties, and they laughed while they did it. I could not stay silent." Her words hung in the air like a blade, impossible to dull. Another email appeared on the screen, this one from a board member to a rival corporation. "Once Knight is out, assets can be transferred without resistance. Prepare contracts in advance." The courtroom erupted again, the judge's gavel pounding for order. The rival executives shifted uncomfortably, their counsel whispering urgently, their polished calm slipping away. Through it all, Adrian remained still, his eyes on Maria, recognizing the courage it had taken for her to speak. She had been overlooked for years, invisible in the hierarchy, and yet now her testimony carried the weight of truth that no amount of wealth or power could silence. When she stepped down, her head held high, Thomas placed a reassuring hand on Adrian's shoulder. The storm had begun to break, and for the first time in weeks, Adrian felt the tide turning in his favor. The air inside the courtroom grew heavier as Thomas Grant rose from his chair, adjusting his glasses with deliberate calm. The rival executives shifted uneasily in their seats, their lawyers whispering hurriedly, stacking papers like shields. Thomas approached the podium, his presence commanding the room without raising his voice. He opened a thick binder and clicked a remote, and instantly the screens lit up with the first contract. The language appeared dry to most, dense with corporate phrasing, but Thomas read each line with practiced clarity, pausing to emphasize the buried poison. "Here," he said, pointing to a clause marked in red. "This provision reallocates Mr. Knight's voting rights to the discretion of the board in the event of reputational harm." Who defined reputational harm? You did. And who staged an event to create it? Your own emails confirm it was you. The executives whispered furiously among themselves, their faces tightening as the jury leaned forward, following every word. Thomas continued without pause, moving to the next section. Clause 14, subsection 3. Intellectual property developed under Knight Holdings is reassigned to a subsidiary. Who controls that subsidiary? Not the shareholders, not the public, but your allies in a rival corporation. He turned to the defendants, his voice still calm. Would you like to explain how this benefits the company, rather than your own accounts? The silence that followed was louder than any denial. One of the defense attorneys rose, objecting to the tone, but the judge waved him down. Thomas pressed on, moving through each document like a surgeon cutting into diseased flesh. He displayed signatures, highlighted amendments, and read aloud casual lines from emails where executives joked about gutting the empire and handing Knight his walking papers. The evidence was meticulous, undeniable, each detail building upon the last until the conspiracy stood fully exposed. Adrian sat still, his eyes on the defendants, watching them squirm under the weight of their own schemes. He had once seen them as allies, partners in growth, but now he saw only opportunists stripped of pretense. Their polished suits and practiced smiles could not hide the panic in their eyes, the tapping of restless fingers against the table, the whispered pleas to their lawyers for strategy that no longer existed. Thomas paused for effect, then introduced financial records obtained through subpoenas filed overnight, bank transfers, coded communications, offshore accounts, all tied directly to those sitting across the aisle. "You didn't just betray a man," Thomas said firmly, his voice resonating in the hushed courtroom. "You betrayed the law, the shareholders, and the trust that built this company. You orchestrated fraud to seize control of billions in assets, and you did it believing no one would notice." The final slide appeared, an internal memo dated weeks before Adrian's humiliation at the store. It detailed plans for the staged denial, outlining how to manipulate press coverage and accelerate the board vote. The words glowed on the screen, damning in their casual cruelty. The judge's expression hardened, the gallery gasped, and the rival executives slumped in their seats, the weight of their betrayal now undeniable. The courtroom had already grown tense from the avalanche of documents and testimony, but Thomas was not finished. He stood at the podium with a calmness that made the rival executives shift uneasily, as though they sensed the blow yet to come. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying steady authority, "we have one final piece of evidence." He signaled to the technician at the side of the room, and the lights dimmed slightly as the speakers crackled to life. A recording began to play, tinny at first, then sharp enough that every word was unmistakable. It was the voice of one of the board members, laughing with careless arrogance. "The CEO who thought he owned respect," the voice sneered. "We'll remind him he only owns what we allow. Let him stand outside a velvet rope like the rest of them. That image will break him faster than any contract ever could." Another voice joined in, chuckling. "Adrian Knight, the empire builder, reduced to a man denied entry. Once the shareholders see that, once the press has its story, the vote will be simple. He won't fight back. He'll vanish quietly, just like we planned." Gasps echoed across the courtroom, reporters' pens scratching furiously, cameras flashing as though they could capture the very sound. Adrian remained motionless, but his eyes locked on the defendants, watching their faces drain of color as their own words condemned them. The judge leaned forward, her expression tightening, her gavel resting firmly in her hand, though she did not strike it. Her eyes shifted between the projection screen and the executives, a flicker of disapproval sharpening into something harder. The defense scrambled to object, claiming the recording was taken out of context, but Thomas countered before they could gain footing. "Context. The context is clear. They mocked the very man who built the company. They planned his public humiliation, and they used that staged moment to justify an unlawful coup. Respect cannot be owned, but betrayal can be proven." He gestured toward the jury, his voice unwavering. "This is not a misunderstanding. This is intent, deliberate and cruel." The judge lifted her hand for silence, the murmurs of the gallery fading quickly. She looked at the defendants with an expression that carried more weight than any words she might have spoken. Her gaze was cool, assessing, but beneath it was unmistakable disapproval, the kind that signaled the tide of justice had turned. Even without a verdict, everyone in the room felt the balance shift. The once confident board members now slouched in their seats, whispering frantically to their attorneys, their polished armor shattered by the sound of their own laughter played aloud for the world to hear. Adrian exhaled slowly, the sting of humiliation he had carried since that night at the store replaced by something stronger. He no longer felt like the man pushed aside, no longer invisible or dismissed. The evidence had spoken louder than their schemes, and in the silence that followed the recording, he realized the battle was no longer about survival. It was about victory. The courtroom was silent as the judge returned with the written decision, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. Adrian sat straight in his chair, his hands clasped together, his expression calm, but his heart steady with anticipation. Across the aisle, the board members shifted nervously, their lawyers whispering last-minute reassurances that sounded hollow even to their own ears. Reporters leaned forward, their pens ready, the hum of cameras waiting to capture the instant history was made. The judge cleared her throat and began to speak, her voice even but carrying authority that left no room for doubt. She reviewed the evidence with measured precision, outlining how the board had staged the scandal at the luxury store, how they had buried clauses in contracts that would have stripped Adrian of his voting rights and transferred his intellectual property to rivals, how their own words recorded and displayed in open court revealed deliberate intent to deceive. She spoke of fiduciary duty, of betrayal of trust, of the manipulation that struck at the heart of corporate governance. Every sentence landed like a hammer, each point building upon the last until the narrative of betrayal stood undeniable. Then came the words that mattered most. This court finds that the removal of Mr. Adrian Knight was unlawful. His intellectual property rights remain intact under the protection of this court, and the actions taken by the defendants constitute fraud and conspiracy. Accordingly, damages in the amount of $85 million are awarded to Mr. Knight, with further penalties to be determined in shareholder proceedings. The sound of the gavel striking echoed through the room like thunder. The gallery erupted in gasps and murmurs, the press scribbling furiously, cameras flashing. Adrian sat still, his face composed, but his eyes betrayed the flicker of release, the quiet satisfaction of vindication. His company, his work, his legacy had not been stolen. Across from him, the board members slumped, their lawyers staring down at the table, their polished calm shattered. Some whispered to each other, already plotting appeals, but the damage was done. Their reputations were finished, their power broken, their scheme exposed before the world. Thomas leaned toward Adrian, his voice low but firm. "You've won more than damages. You've reclaimed your place. They cannot erase you now." Adrian gave a small nod, his gaze steady on the judge who was already preparing to leave the bench. He felt the weight in his chest lift, replaced by a resolve that was colder, sharper, more enduring than before. The empire he had built still stood, scarred but unbroken, and now strengthened by truth. As the courtroom emptied, reporters surged forward, microphones reaching, cameras flashing, but Adrian walked past them in silence, his steps steady, his shoulders squared. He had no need to boast or explain. The verdict itself was enough. The law had spoken, the betrayal undone, the empire reclaimed. Respect could not be bought or staged, it had to be earned, and today he had earned it back in the eyes of the world. The morning sun spilled across the glass facade of the company headquarters as Adrian approached, his stride measured, his suit pressed to perfection, his presence undeniable. Just weeks earlier, he had walked out of the same building carrying a briefcase filled with betrayal, his name already whispered as a man finished, but today was different. The guards at the front entrance straightened as he neared, their eyes flicking briefly to one another before they stepped aside without a word. Where once there had been hesitation, now there was deference. Adrian offered a curt nod as he passed, his reflection catching in the tall doors, no longer blurred by rain but sharpened by vindication. Inside, the lobby buzzed with hushed excitement. Employees paused at their desks and along the marble floors, glancing toward him with cautious admiration. The atmosphere was not one of noisy celebration, but of quiet respect, the kind that runs deeper than applause. A receptionist who had once barely acknowledged his presence now straightened her posture, offering a smile tinged with relief. Adrian returned it faintly, his mind not on triumph, but on the path still ahead. Respect had shifted, but it had to be held with steady hands. As he entered the elevator, two younger associates stepped in behind him. They spoke no words, yet he could feel their energy, their admiration for the man who had faced down betrayal and walked back into power. When the doors opened onto the executive floor, the sight that greeted him was starkly different from the day of his exile. No laughter, no dismissive glances, only silence that carried the weight of recognition. The offices of the board members who had plotted against him now stood empty, their names already stripped from the glass walls. Employees lined the hallway, their quiet cheers little more than whispers of support, but to Adrian they sounded like thunder. He walked past them without breaking stride, but inside he felt the warmth of loyalty returning, the acknowledgement that could never be faked. Respect once taken had been restored, not because of fear, but because of truth laid bare in court for all to see. He reached the corner office that had once been his and pushed the door open. The familiar scent of polished wood and leather greeted him, though the desk was bare, stripped of the photographs and trophies he had carried out weeks before. He crossed the room, laid his hand against the desk, and for a moment allowed himself to breathe. The empire was his again, not given, not begged for, but reclaimed. Outside the window, the city stretched vast and alive, the same city that had once watched him fall, now bearing witness to his return. Adrian adjusted his cuffs, straightened his shoulders, and turned back to the room, already thinking of the work ahead. Betrayal had cost him trust, but it had also given him clarity. He would rebuild stronger than before, not for revenge, but for the respect that no rope, no vote, and no scheme could take away again. The news spread through the building like fire, moving from office to office, whispered at first, and then spoken with certainty. The board members who had plotted against Adrian were finished. Their resignations, once unthinkable, were signed and sealed, each name crossed from the company directory, each door emptied of power. Some left quietly, avoiding the stares of employees, while others attempted to defend themselves with hollow statements about loyalty and vision. But no one listened. Their betrayal had been exposed too publicly, their arrogance recorded too clearly, their downfall inevitable. For the first time in years, the company corridors carried a feeling not of fear or suspicion, but of relief. The poison that had lingered at the top was gone. Adrian stood in the auditorium, the same place where launches had once been celebrated with flashing lights and champagne. This time, the room was filled with employees from every level, from junior analysts to department heads, waiting to hear what would come next. The weight of expectation pressed against him, but he welcomed it. He looked out over the crowd, the faces of people who had seen him mocked, exiled, and then vindicated, and he spoke with the calm strength of a man who had faced fire and survived. "What happened here will never happen again," he began, his voice carrying through the silence. "No more hidden clauses buried in contracts, no more silent betrayals behind closed doors. Transparency will not be an idea, it will be our foundation." He outlined reforms with precision, sweeping governance changes that struck at the very roots of the conspiracy. All contracts would now be subject to independent review. All major decisions open to scrutiny from shareholders and employees alike. Whistleblowers would be protected, not punished, given the chance to bring concerns forward without fear of exile. "We cannot build an empire on secrets," Adrian said, his eyes sweeping the room. "We cannot build trust on silence. This company was almost lost because of arrogance and greed, but we will not let it happen again." Applause rose slowly, hesitant at first, and then stronger, building into a wave that filled the room. Adrian did not smile, but his chest tightened with something close to pride. This was not the hollow cheer of shareholders pleased with rising numbers. This was the sound of people believing change was real. When the applause faded, he continued, his tone steady. "I was betrayed by people I once trusted, but I was also supported by those who were overlooked." Maria Lopez, a name few of you knew, risked her career to bring the truth forward. Let that remind us all that value does not always wear a title. Respect must be earned, and recognition must be given where it is due. As he stepped down from the stage, the employees rose, not out of obligation, but out of respect. The reckoning was complete. The traitors were gone, the foundations reset, and the empire stood ready to be built anew, stronger than ever. Months passed, and the storm that had once threatened to bury Adrian's name had become a story told in business journals and classrooms, cited as an example of how power can shift when arrogance overreaches. The company was steady again, the reforms he had introduced proving more than promises. Shareholders who once doubted him now praised his vision. Employees who once whispered in fear now spoke with confidence. And Adrian himself had settled into a quieter rhythm, one that allowed him to reflect on what legacy truly meant. For years he had measured success in market share, in expansions, in towers that rose with his company's logo shining from their sides. But the courtroom battle had changed him. It had shown him that dignity, once lost, was harder to reclaim than profit, and that his victory meant little unless it became a foundation for others to stand on. One crisp morning, he signed the final papers to establish the Knight Legal Fellowship, a program designed to fund scholarships for underrepresented law students, young people who dreamed of fighting the very kind of corporate injustice that had almost destroyed him. He remembered Maria Lopez, her steady voice cutting through the courtroom, her courage in risking everything while others stayed silent. Her example had convinced him that the law was not just a shield for the powerful, but a weapon that could protect those dismissed and overlooked. He wanted others like her to have the resources she had never been given, to ensure that truth had champions long after his own battles were over. The announcement of the fellowship drew attention across the industry, some praising it as philanthropy, others dismissing it as image building. But Adrian cared little for their opinions. What mattered were the students who would now step into courtrooms carrying the strength of education he had made possible, voices that would not be silenced, defenders for those who had no power of their own. He visited universities quietly, meeting applicants, hearing their stories of struggle, of families working multiple jobs, of parents denied justice because no one stood beside them. He saw in their eyes the same fire that had carried him through the long nights of betrayal, and he knew he was investing not in charity, but in the future. Back in his office, the city stretching wide beyond the windows, Adrian kept a single frame on his desk. It was the court ruling, carefully preserved, its words clear and final. He did not keep it as revenge against those who had tried to destroy him, for their downfall had already written its own ending. He kept it as proof that dignity, once defended, was stronger than manipulation, stronger than whispers, stronger than the velvet rope that had once tried to block his path. Beside it sat a fresh stack of fellowship applications, names of students whose battles were still ahead. Adrian touched the frame lightly before turning back to his work, a quiet smile forming as he realized that his true empire was no longer just built on steel and glass, but on opportunity, justice, and the unshakable belief that respect cannot be stolen when it is rooted in integrity. If this story moved you like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.